Hi guys, this is Emma. Welcome back to the channel. You're at Crime Stories Obsessed. We have a case for you tonight. Thank you for all the returning subscribers that continue to come and watch the content here over at Crime Stories Obsessed. If you're new to the channel, I really hope you enjoy the content that we provide here. And for anybody who wants to support the channel, please press subscribe and keep the notification bell on so that you never miss any new content. The 1st of November 1980, truck driver passing by Sam Houston National Forest found a victim's body nude with the exception of a chain necklace with a rectangular pendant. She was lying face down 20 feet from the shoulder of I-45 North, a half-mile south of FM 1696 exit and 2 miles north of Huntsville, Texas. High-heeled sandals were thrown in proximity to her body. But where had she come from? Who was she? So let's have a little bit more of an in-depth look at this terrible crime. With Emma Louise. This is the story of a Jane Doe that was recovered and eventually, after 40 years, was named. In Forest Lake, Minnesota, lived Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was born in March 1966, although we're not quite sure where she lived when she was born. But she did live in Forest Lake, Minnesota with her father, Don Jarvis Sr., who eventually died in 2018, and her mother, Kerry, who died in 2019. She lived with her mother and father and 5 siblings. In 1979, she attended Forest Lake Middle School as an 8th grader. Friends called her Toddy, and she apparently liked hanging out with her friends and listening to music. Now, due to the fact that she missed so many days of school, CPS eventually took her into temporary custody and placed her in a shelter for troubled teens in Stillwater. Where she stayed was an emergency state crisis home for children between the ages of 12 and 18, and were usually placed there while their parents awaited court hearings for custody. This was when she was 13 years of age. Now, in March 1980, she was due to attend Washington Juvenile Court for some reason, which we're not quite sure of. Her and 2 of her sisters decided, who were also living with her in this shelter, that they didn't want to be in there. They didn't want to be locked away with people they didn't know, and they decided that they were going to run away. So one of the sisters who owned a car decided that they would all go together, the 3 of them. But after a short period of time, 2 of the sisters decided that they'd had a change of heart. They didn't want to run away anymore and they wanted to go home. But Sherry, being the strong-minded person she was and determined that she was not going back to live that life, she decided to stay and carry on her journeys. She was intelligent, she was quite street smart, and due to the fact that she was a kind, caring person with a big smile, she probably told people about her abusive home life and where she was living. She was gone for 7 months until she was found dead on the I-45 in Texas. But what happened to her, and how did we get to this? Who did she meet on her travels? It's still unknown. In August 1980, 5 months after running away, she did actually write a letter and contacted her family to say that she was safe, even sending them a photograph of herself. She did not want to stay where she was staying and eventually made it to Denver, Colorado. She did tell her family that she would come back, but not until she was between the ages of 18 and 21. but did promise them that she would return. The photo that she sent her family was of herself in a basement, and it looked like somebody had taken it for her. But who was she staying with? Who took the photo? Nobody knows any of this, and nobody has ever come forward to say that they'd met Sherry Ann while she was on her travels. No details have been released from the family about what the letter included, what was in it, or what else she said. Her family eventually hired a private detective to try and find Sherry, as well as reporting her missing. After she turned 18, police removed her from their missing persons lists. And Sherry's friends looked for her, the family looked for her. 41 years on, and no one knew where she was or what had ever happened to her. Not long after the family had received the letter in August, on Halloween night in 1980 in Huntsville, she had been dropped off by a white man in a blue Cherry Capri at truck stop. She should have been trick-or-treating that night back home with family and just having a good time with friends. But apparently, truck stop, she looked dishevelled and unwell. She was asking for directions for a men's prison. A waitress looking at the Hitching Post truck stop on Interstate 45 said the girl came into the restaurant the same evening and again asked for directions to the Ellis unit, saying she had a friend there. A map was drawn for her and she departed. When the waitresses asked how old the female was, she responded and told them that she was 19. The waitress thought that this was an obvious lie and then asked the girl if her parents knew where she was. The young girl replied, "Who cares?" The waitress then asked her where she was from, but the girl then mentioned Arkansas Pass, Rockport area. She'd gone into this restaurant and after asking for directions, having some banter with the employees, and then asking if there was somewhere she might be able to sleep for the night. She carried on walking, and then no one ever heard from her again. Maybe she was picked up by the wrong person, but whoever it was had beaten her, raped her, strangled her, and even bitten her. Her strappy sandals were found not far from her body. But why was she looking for a men's prison? Were they actually going to let her in when she got there? Why was she on her own? Did she not make friends on the way? She was a long way from where she'd started. 14 hours. How did she get there? She can't have walked. She had no car. Was she hitching rides? But nobody ever came forward to say that they'd given her a lift. What was she doing for food? Was she managing to get something from somewhere? Somebody must have been helping her. Who knows? 40 years ago. And no one has come forward to say they know anything. No one came forward to say they'd given her a lift in their truck or given her some food, maybe given her somewhere to sleep for the night. So many unanswered questions. Her brother would later say that Sherry Ann always hung around with the bad boys. There was a theory at one point, as there was 2 other Jane Does with similar injuries that were also found along the highway, and it was questioned whether her murder could be linked to the other 2. By the looks of it, she'd been dead for roughly 6 hours. The body of the teenage girl was found 20 feet from the shoulder of the Interstate 45, just north of Huntsville. Her red high heels lay nearby, and except for the gold chain with the smoky blue rectangular pendant, which was at the time hanging around her neck, she was naked. The only clues to her identity that police could muster came through the testimonies of a manager and 2 workers at the nearby South End Gulf gas station. They'd spotted her wearing a white knit sweater, a yellow pullover, and blue jeans. She was carrying the high heels. For more than 40 years, She was known only as Walker County Jane Doe, nameless, assaulted victim that perplexed law enforcement and captivated the true crime community for years.
For 40 years, her identity has been a mystery. Found strangled to death on the side of the highway near Huntsville in 1980.
What about this case has gotten so many people's attention?
In a statement, Sherry's family says she ran away and left a letter promising them she'd return, but never did. Investigators don't know how she got to Texas because investigators thought her murder might be connected to other cases, and the sheriff says that possibility still remains. The next big question: who killed Sherry Ann Jarvis?
She made it to the page of missing and exploited children. Cause of death: homicide by ligature strangulation. They described her as between 14 and 18 years of age, most likely 14 to 16 years of age. White, a female, standing around 5'6", weighing 100 to 110 pounds, with light brown hair, around 10-inch long, cut into a kind of wing fashion. This natural colour with no evidence of her hair ever being dyed. They said her eye colour was hazel, and distinguishing marks that she had a scar at the end of her right eyebrow. She had pierced ears, although no earrings were recovered, and her toenails were painted a delicate shade of pink. The general condition of the body and overall health and nutrition indicated she was raised in a middle-class household and possibly had an inverted right nipple. The dental record said that her teeth had been well cared for, she had some fillings, and that her teeth were well aligned, although orthodontic treatment could not be confirmed. They took fingerprints and DNA. The clothing, they said, she may have been wearing jeans, a yellow shirt with large pockets, pantyhose, a pair of red leather high sandals, 3 to 4 inch platforms with light brown straps, and these had been thrown to the side of the body. She had a rectangular shaped pendant on, with a smoky blue glass stone on a very thin gold chain, but no personal items were noted. So when the truck driver was passing by this Sam Houston National Forest, he had come across the victim's body nude, with the exception of this chain necklace. She was lying face down, 20 feet from shoulder I-45. It was determined she was likely killed during the early hours of the morning. She'd been sexually assaulted with a blunt instrument, beaten and strangled with her pantyhose, which may not have belonged to her, they were not sure, and she had a deep bite wound on her right shoulder, but no semen was found on or near the victim's body. When the murder became known through media accounts, several people came forward and said they had seen a teenager matching her description the day before her body was found. It had not been verified who the girl was, and all the witnesses that came forward have since died. A witness identified the victim as a girl who had been at the Southend Gulf station at around 6:30 p.m. on Halloween night asking for directions to Ellis Prison. She'd been wearing blue jeans, a yellow pullover sweater with large pockets that hung below her waist, and she was carrying these high-heeled red sandals. Her photograph was shown to every inmate at Ellis Prison Unit, but they all denied knowing who she was. And the nature of the relationship to who she planned to visit still remains unknown as to whether the individual was an inmate or an employee. Nobody ever knew this information. Had the subject seen alive being the victim? It had been speculated that she had been killed in a secluded area of the truck stop after asking a trucker to allow her to sleep in the sleeper cab, as the prison would have been closed to visitors by the time she had arrived. On January the 16th, 1981, the unidentified girl was buried at the Oakwood Cemetery after a funeral service was held, and the Huntsville Funeral Home buried her, and Morris Memorials provided her tombstone. By the time she was buried, dozens of females had been found murdered or disposed of in suspicious manner along the interstate highways in Texas, specifically around cities such as Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. The murders were conducted in a similar fashion, involving strangulation, sexual assault, and rape. Several victims, including this female, had been sexually assaulted without being conventionally raped. A majority of the victims were either known or suspected prostitutes, although there was no evidence that this was particular to this victim. Decades later, it was suggested that there was a possibility that the victim, along with 2 other victims and another female who had since been identified, were killed by the same offender. All 4 had been left along North Freeway of Interstate 45 during 1980. The additional unidentified victims were both located in Houston, and they had been murdered and sexually assaulted in a similar way. There were initial speculations that the unidentified teen was murdered by Henry Lee Lucas, but investigators could not make a match between the bite mark on her left shoulder and his dental reconstruction. Lucas was well known for his confession spree. The vast majority were false or coerced statements. Her body was exhumed in 1999 and examined by a forensic anthropologist to better obtain information regarding her age, her height, as well as to obtain a DNA sample which was suitable for only a CODIS entry. Everything changed in July 2020 when the Walker County Sheriff's Department lead investigator on the case, Detective Thomas Bean, received a call from Othram, a Woodlands-based forensic DNA lab, and given the perplexing nature of the crime and the fact that it was committed less than 50 miles from the company's campus, Walker County Jane Doe was on the radar as a potential case, and they offered assistance. They'd already made headlines for helping solve cold cases via forensic genetic genealogy, an investigative method that combines advanced DNA analysis with traditional genealogy research. So the detective accepted the offer, and the lab soon realized why this case had been cold for so long. There was little viable evidence for forensic genealogical testing. Much of the victim's skeletal remains, a femur and a tooth, being sent to the lab in October 2020, had decayed over the decades and had been repeatedly tested by other labs, which had stripped away almost all the usable genetic material. It wasn't the first time that the scientists had run into such a challenge, and they rarely have a luxury of working with high-quality genetic samples. They're typically left to scrutinise specimens that are far older, far smaller, and far less intact than those yielded by at-home DNA testing kits. But the lab's technology was designed to recover and enhance the quantities of degraded forensic evidence. Following several weeks' worth of work, the scientists determined that even they couldn't glean enough from Walker County Jane Doe's skeletal remains. Fortunately, Bean had another piece of evidence at his disposal, a piece of brain tissue that had been preserved in what's referred to as a formalin fixed paraffin embedded block, a process that protects DNA proteins and vital structures. The brain tissue was heavily damaged by the chemical solution, but it was easily the best piece of evidence the scientists had, and everything changed from there. While previous tests of the tissue by other labs had proven inconclusive, they managed to identify 9 nanograms of DNA molecules from it using specialized techniques to enhance it. Once they'd reconstructed enough of the victim's DNA, the scientists began sorting through tens of thousands of samples of third-party databases looking for matches. And it was an audacious, weeks-long process, but in March 2021, They'd whittled down their list of potential matches from distant relatives to 6 people they believed were either the parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, or some family members of their Jane Doe. From there, it was up to Bean to verify whether the leads were for real. That meant rifling through online databases, social media platforms, etc., and eventually homing in on Sherry Jarvis's siblings, who confirmed to him that they'd indeed had a missing family member. Following months of heart-wrenching conversations, follow-up investigations, and genetic testing of fresh DNA samples from the family to the government labs, they later confirmed in late September that Sherry had been found. Until now, this family had no idea where Sherry was. They needed time to mourn the fact that their sister had been killed, and in such a horrific way. The detectives were pleased that they'd finally been able to give a name to their Jane Doe that they'd had on their books for 40 years. The identification of this young woman, Sherry, brought some sense of closure. But the detective said, "What drives me most is being able to provide answers. These cases happened so long ago. With the exception of some of the dedicated web sleuths and DNA forensics, they were able to give a name to Walker County Jane Doe." The local police department's sheriff's office actively monitor missing persons cases for any potential matches. Investigators reached out to the public via various online web sleuths, websites, news media and television networks in hope of generating further lines of inquiry, all of which to date have been unsuccessful in identifying her murderer. But after 40 years, is there a chance that this person could have already have died? If the murderer had have been in their 30s, they would now be 70 years of age, 70 years plus. And if they'd been in their 40s, the chance of them still being alive is slim to none. There was possibly somebody who knew something, somebody who had a relative acting strangely around that time, or the murderer may have told someone about what they'd done. Nobody ever came forward, and to this day, there has never been any justice for Sherry Jarvis. But at least there has been a name to the Walker County Jane Doe. They are no longer a Jane Doe, they are a person, Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, and she was loved. Her mother and father died, not knowing whether she was still alive or not. But fortunately, her family now have some answers about what happened to Sherry Ann Jarvis.